presented by South Country Co-op.
Over the last 2 weeks, I drove 7,052 kilometers to see family, friends, and most importantly, museums and statues. And I did so in both Canada and the United States. So let's start this edition of Traveling with Dan in the third largest city in Northern Ontario after Sudbury and Thunder Bay. We're starting in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. The Roberta Bondar Park and Tent Pavilion is named after Canada's first female astronaut, and it's an outdoor venue that can accommodate a variety of special events. The venue is located in downtown Sault Ste. Marie on the shore of the St. Mary's River. Dr. Bondar was born in Sault Ste. Marie, and she journeyed into space on January 22nd, 1992 on board the Space Shuttle Discovery. There's also a building named after Bondar in the Sioux. Neil Armstrong has a building named after him in his hometown as well. Armstrong is from Wapakoneta, Ohio, located 2 hours southwest of Detroit and almost 3 hours southwest of Cleveland. The first man on the moon grew up in Wapakoneta, which is now the home of the Armstrong Air and Space Museum. Inside the museum contains more space exploration exhibits and artifacts than you will find in most science museums. Outside are several statues of Armstrong and a pair of planes he flew both before and after stepping on the moon. But once you drive all the way to the Armstrong Air and Space Museum, you'll want to get inside as soon as possible. The museum follows the life of Neil Armstrong with many artifacts from his childhood through his earliest days flying and the entirety of the first man on the moon's life. The museum is home to the actual spacesuit, this one right here, that Armstrong wore while piloting the Gemini 8 spacecraft. And they have the Gemini 8 spacecraft as well, flown by Neil Armstrong and David Scott on March 16, 1966, to accomplish the first docking of two crafts in space. I stood and looked at these artifacts for hours. There are many models, diagrams, and art pieces on display in Wapakoneta, including this statue, painting, and bust of Neil Armstrong. Now, this was one of my favorite locations in the entire museum, the Infinity Room. This has been an exhibit at the museum since it first opened in 1972. The room feels like you can touch the stars as you walk through the twinkling passageway. It's awesome. The Apollo 11 moon landing was one of the single greatest achievements in the history of mankind. Neil Armstrong's spacesuit was a key part of that achievement. The actual spacesuit that he wore on the moon is housed in the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. His backup suit, it's behind me on display at the Neil Armstrong Air and Space Museum. So cool. You can also watch a movie about the moon landing that takes place in the round moon, like part of the building. It runs every 30 minutes all day long. There are many models, diagrams, and art pieces on display at the museum, but most of it never actually touched or walked on the moon. But this item did. This one came directly from the moon. While on their historic Apollo 11 mission in July of 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin collected lunar samples to bring back to Earth to be tested, including this moon rock, which is on display behind glass at the Armstrong Museum. Awesome, awesome, awesome. One of the most interesting items on display was all newspapers from around the world and their headlines the day after the moon landing, showing how the world stopped for the day and focused on one single thing. Now, the latter half of the displays in the Armstrong Air and Space Museum focus less on Neil Armstrong and more on the other journeys that were made into space, including those by the space shuttles, including the mission by Canada's first female astronaut, Dr. Roberta Bondar. I have been a fan of Neil Armstrong ever since I was a little kid, absolutely inspired by what he accomplished on and off the moon. I loved this opportunity to walk the streets of Wapakoneta, Ohio, where he was born, and see the items he actually wore into space, and items that came oh so close. Now, when you buy a ticket to go into the Armstrong Museum, it's good the whole day. And that was great for me as I wandered through the place 3 times and watched the movie on the moon landing during all 3 times. Completely fascinated the entire time, and I can tell you, it's absolutely worth the drive, which, for the record, is only 2,668 kilometers southeast of Medicine Hat. Now, coming up in 2 weeks on the next episode of Traveling with Dan, we're staying in Ohio as I take you to and through the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and Museum.
Traveling with Dan is presented by South Country Co-op.